All right. It looks like everyone has joined us for the moment. We may have a few people join us afterwards, but welcome and good afternoon. Today is Monday, June 15th, and this is officially a work session to, let's make sure I'm following the agenda. Or Ms. Lewis, can we take a roll call, please?
Yes. Mr. Ross? I saw him. Mr. Ross?
Present.
Ms. Shotke?
Here.
Mrs. Williams?
Present.
Dr. Baker?
Here.
Ms. Davis?
Here.
Dr. Flores?
Present.
Ms. Lewis is here. Reverend Matias? Not yet. President Grant?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion for approval.
Support.
All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, same sign. All right. Next, we would like to acknowledge our resolution for COVID-19 board meeting rules and public participation in electronic meetings. This resolution allows us to gather online in an open meeting where the public can join us, as it originated while we were under stay-at-home order, and it is still in effect until further notice. So we will share with the public and the full board when changes do occur. All right, we have a few action items on the list. First is the Michigan High School Athletic Association membership resolution for 2020 and 2021. Do I have any questions around this item? All right, do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Support.
Ms. Lewis?
Mr. Ross?
Yes.
Ms. Shotke?
Yes.
Mrs. Williams?
Yes.
Dr. Baker?
Yes.
Ms. Davis?
Yes.
Dr. Flores?
Yes.
Ms. Lewis? Reverend Matias? President Grant? Motion
Yes.
carries.
All right, next we have the purchasing agenda. Do I have any items for discussion or any questions here?
I do have a question. I think I know the answer, but maybe just a little explanation on the MCEA dues. I'm assuming that's just says dues, but that's maybe more liability insurance. I saw the cost of 700 or some thousand, and for membership dues, that obviously. So, but I did a little research, and I guess that's more insurance. Is that accurate?
Yeah, yes, Ms. Grant, may I?
Yes.
So, Mr. Ross, you are correct. That's property general liability insurance. This is every single year to middle cities. So this is a comparable amount from previous years, and every single year you have voted on this particular item for middle cities.
Thanks. Yeah, I recall seeing that. Just when I saw it listed as dues, it just got my attention. I thought that must be some serious perks associated with $700,000 in dues, but thank you.
Were you interested in the perks?
Are there any other questions on the purchasing agenda? If not, do I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve the purchasing agenda?
So moved.
All right, Ms. Lewis?
Sounded like John. Was that John?
Yes.
That was me, ma'am.
Okay, I'll put you in here now. All right, Mr. Ross,
Yes.
Ms. Shotke,
Yes.
Ms. Williams,
Yes.
Dr. Baker,
Yes.
Ms. Davis,
Yes.
Dr. Flores,
Yes.
Ms. Lewis, Reverend Matias,
Yes.
and President Grant.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right. We are, we have a few reports listed, and the main reason why we're here today, our topic of conversation. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Gorman as we get into Budget Amendment 2.
Okay, so Madam President, members of the board, I'd like to ask our CFO, Larry Oberst, to come forward. His first items will be discussing Budget Amendment 2 for General Operating Fund, and then another budget amendment for Special Revenue Fund. So I believe Mr. Oberst is on his way in. There he is.
I'm here. Good afternoon, Madam President, Interim Superintendent, Dr. Gorman, Superintendent in Waiting, Dr. Roby, and all the members of the Board of Education. The first two things I would like to discuss would be Amendment 2 for the 1920 year, the current year we're in. And the reason I have this as a report, because as you will see here in a few minutes, to adopt the General Fund Amendment 2 would get us below the 5% fund balance that is in the board policy. So the board policy would have to be amended in order to adopt Amendment 2. The Special Revenue Fund Amendment, there's no such requirement. There's just a technical change there. It's not really involved. And there is no changes in the Debt Retirement Fund. So there is no Debt Retirement Fund Amendment 2. What we did back in Amendment 1 for the Debt Retirement Fund still holds true for the end of the year. So let me just briefly talk through the General Fund Amendment 2. You look in your board packet to the page at the top of the page, it's titled Memo, Board of Education from me, the General Fund, and then there's a list of items for those. You've seen this presentation before in prior amendments. And at the very top, as you can see there, it shows we started the year with a fund balance of almost 12.3 million, 12,262,000. The original adoption used $1.5 million of that. Amendment 1 used 2.47 more of it. And then we're proposing in Amendment 2 to use another 2.1 million, which would get us down to a fund balance, projected fund balance at the end of this June of just over $6.1 million. And that is it's about 4.2% of fund balance. And the board policy states that the fund balance goal is 10%. With a maximum of 15% and a minimum of 5%. And that's computed per the early warning requirements too. So I've spoken with Ms. Pitts about that. And so again, I'm suggesting we review Amendment 2 and then the meeting on June 29th, we adopt, or we at least put to a vote, the adoption of Amendment 2 in the General Fund and the Special Revenue Fund, as well as the 2021 budget. If you look below that, the tables there, let me just point out some of the significant changes. You look at the local sources, and I'm looking at line F. It's titled Decrease in Building Sales Revenue. Our initial budget last year had $1.5 million of revenue of building sales. The only sale we completed during the year was the closing of the West Leonard sale. And then the COVID-19 hit before anything else occurred. So we were short about $1,491,000. So that's a decrease in general operations revenue for Amendment 2. If you look down below to the sources section, line 0, you'll see a decrease in membership revenue, totals 4.775. That is part of the, right now, projected $650 per student cut in state aid. Right now, there's a projected $1.1 billion deficit in the school aid fund by the end of the state's fiscal year. And they have to end the year with a balanced budget. So we are projecting 350 of that would be pushed into the current fiscal year. The other $300 to get to the 650, I'll talk about when I talk about the 2021 budget. We are assuming that'll come through in the 2021 year. So by the end of next year, end of June 2021, and we'll have a total of 650, at this point, what we know, total of $650 per student cut in state aid. Whether part of it happens this year or next year, doesn't really matter. By the end of next year, it will all come out in the end, so to speak. But that's a major impact on the state sources. Then down their third section there, the federal sources. You look at line AD, this is in the grants column, all right? Again, I want to remind you that the grants column have no impact on our fund balance. Revenue equals expenditures. So where we had reductions or increases in revenue up top, we would have decreases or increases in expenditures down below. So the impact on fund balance would be 0. You can see line AD, increase in Title 1A and Title 1D grants. It was a long time in coming to get our final application for those titles done. And it resulted in about $1,711,000 in additional revenue we're projecting compared to where we're at in February. Then line AH, increase in ESSER funding of about $1.1 million. I've mentioned this in a prior meeting, we have a ESSER, which is part of the CARES Act. We have about an $8 million grant through the state that we have until essentially through September of 2021 to spend. However, we have to share that almost $8 million with the non-public schools that have operations, buildings within our boundaries, primarily the Catholic schools and the Christian schools. The computation of the allocation, unlike the Title I, is different. The direction from the Department of Education is that the allocation to the private schools should be based on total enrollment, not free and reduced or poverty levels, if you will. So as a result, it allocates about $2.5 million in total to the non-public schools. That leaves $5.5 million for us. We have the ability to essentially use these dollars in any way we see fit. So as you'll see when I talk about the 2021 budget, we've used part of it to plug the budget hole. And we've actually had some expenditures in the current year related to our distant learning program and other COVID-19 related expenditures. So we're going to recognize almost $1.1 million in the current 19-20 year. The other about $4.5 million will be recognized in the 2021 year. When I talk about that budget, I will show you that again. So that's the major impacts on the revenue side for Amendment 2. You can see at the very bottom there, you'll see the total revenue adjustments for the general operating fund, 6.2 million decrease. The increase in revenue for the grants column is just over $3 million, and athletics is just a minor adjustment. Anybody have any questions on that before I turn to the next page on expenditures? If you turn to the next page then, and you'll see the major impacts on the expense side. Let me just point out a few of them. If you look at line AT in the grants column, you'll see grant related adjustments. Again, We had an increase in grant-related revenue. This is the increase in, part of the increase in the expense to offset that. As I said earlier, for grants column, revenue has to equal expenses. So we increase revenue, we're going to increase expenses. If you look down at line BA, it's that wide line under support services. You'll see in the grant column an increase of $1.3 million. Most of that's at almost $1.1 million ESSER revenue that we recognized, talked about it a minute ago. That's the expense side of that we're to offset that. Also look at line AW under support services, the general operation columns, reduction of $3.1 million. We did have some savings in labor costs, as when we shut down, we still had some vacancies that we were actively looking to fill, and we ended up not filling those vacancies. There also was some adjustments to the benefit side as we got better information, primarily on the health benefits. The hard cap increased in January, and we didn't have all the, we also had an open enrollment that took effect on January 1st. So by the time we did Amendment 1, we didn't have all the impact of that open enrollment on the increase in the hard cap. So there's some benefit and retirement reductions there, totaling $3.1 million. The very last, at the very bottom there, you see total expense adjustments. In the general operation column, a decrease of almost 4.1 million. On the grant side, an increase of just over 3 million. Again, that's equal to the increase in revenue on the prior page. And the same thing with athletics, a small impact that way. So if you look back the prior page, again, to remind you, we had a total revenue decrease of 6.2 million, offset by expense decreases of almost 4.1 million. And that's where we had the decrease in the fund balance by virtue of Amendment 2 of 2.1 million to get us down to the 6.1 million projected fund balance at June 30th, 15 days from now. Let me pull up for you while you're digesting that.
Larry O, would this be a good time to bring Chris in to kind of set some context before, or please let me know how you'd like to proceed, Larry.
Yeah, let me finish the amendments first. Let's bring it before we get into 2021.
Thank you.
I just was going to show you. Let me get it up here. Here we go. Everybody see this fund balance analysis? It's showing up now?
Yep.
Colored columns, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at column AR, the blue shaded column, that's the projected fund balance after Amendment 2 would be adopted in the unchanged from what I just presented to you. You can see the ending fund balance, 6 million, the very top line there, 6,115,000. There's the revenue components under the early warning and board policy computation. You can see at the very bottom there, the fund balance projected would be 4.21% below our 5% fund balance. We'll come back to this after we talk about the 2021 budget and review the fund balance at that point in time. So questions? Otherwise, here we go. Okay. Any questions on general fund amendment 1 or 2? I'm sorry, amendment 2. Again, the plan would be to bring this back to you in 2 weeks for your final approval, pending an amendment to your current board policy. I sent over some wording to Ms. Pitts today. There is a policy committee, I believe, on Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. She'll address with that committee on Wednesday. I just briefly want to turn a couple of pages back to amendment on the special revenue fund. There's just one, again, if you go to the page, it has memo at the top and to Board of Education. You'll see a similar presentation that we just looked at with the general operating fund. Special revenue is mostly our food service and our GRASS program. That's where the center programs used to be that no longer exist with us. The major change there is the very first line there under the table. You'll see delayed implementation of GASB 84. GASB 84, which was to be effective in the current year, changed the reporting of certain endowments that we have, required they go into a special revenue fund. So special revenue fund budget that you adopted at the end of this fiscal year included that change. Because of the COVID-19 crisis, the adoption was deferred for a year. We decided, because it was going to take some work for us, some detailed work that frankly we didn't want to deal with this year, everything else going on. So we've deferred that until next year. So that $700,000 adjustment is just to reverse what we had put in there at the beginning of the year. That's it. There's some other minor adjustments, but nothing significant. There is no fund balance requirement for special revenue fund. At the very top there, you can see into the double line, the $4.8 million projected fund balance at June 30th. So the fund balance actually is in fine shape. And that's really all I want to say about this special revenue fund, unless anybody has any questions. Okay, hearing none, I would recommend Dr. Gorman, this would be a time to bring in.
Yep,
Chris.
thank you. So Ms. Grant, with your permission, I'd like to bring in Chris Glass. Chris is the director of the West Michigan Talent Triangle. Larry got into some details about our budget, of course, and we'll continue to get into the weeds as the presentation goes forward. But right now, I'd like Chris Glass to really set some context from a state perspective, so you know what's happening in Lansing right now. And there's no one better to do this than Chris. So Chris, if you're available, Craig, can we please pull Chris Glass in?
I am here, Dr. Gorman, and thank you for this opportunity, boards of education members. I appreciate the chance to inform you of what's happening at the state level, and that really puts a great deal of context to the comments that Larry shared with you regarding school budgets. We are facing some pretty stark times given the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's a lot of work that is going into our advocacy efforts related to protecting school funding at the state level, and that certainly is going to require some assistance from Congress at the federal level. What I'd like to do is share some information with you just to give you some perspective about the situation that we're facing. It was a little over a month ago that the chair of the Senate K-12 Appropriations Committee indicated that cutting the foundation grant is a last resort, but it's going to happen. At this read, he told MERS the 10% level will not get the job done, and more likely the target is between 20% and 25%. I think everybody at that moment had an understanding there was going to be a significant financial hurdle we had to overcome as a state, but there was not any context from anybody in a position of authority regarding what we might see with a reduction. Now, the good news is the reduced levels we're speaking about right now are not near the levels that are referenced in this article, but that sort of was a moment of awakening for many people. So I just want to give you some context here from the economy and the revenue perspective. Due to the stay-at-home orders that were put in place to protect public health, as you know, there were dramatic impacts on our economy, both in terms of economic activity and jobs for residents all across the state. In fact, our unemployment rates reached 25%, and we saw stark declines in many of our tax collections, whether that be sales tax, income tax, and other taxes the state collects. So what does this mean? It's important to put this in context because the revenues that are funding schools in the state of Michigan for the school year we just finished is predicated on collecting taxes until October 1st. And so the state of Michigan is always trying to predict the revenues it's bringing in order to fund the government services that are being provided in the year of the collection. So as you might imagine, when you have a pandemic like we saw and we are currently in, there's a significant departure from what is normal operating business and normal collections. And therefore, there's been a significant disruption in the revenues the state anticipated receiving, and thus schools are expecting to receive. So what is that difference? In January, Governor Whitmer built her budget based on the revenue projections in the school aid fund. We saw that there was $13.925 billion that we anticipated collecting. As of May 15th, that number is now 12.676, or a $1.25 billion difference in collections from what we thought we were going to see in January to what we now expect in May. Furthermore, they are expecting that we will collect less revenue heading into next school year as well. So this reduction carries forward. We were anticipating having 14.317 billion, and instead they are now expecting 13.18 billion, a significant shortfall from what those expectations were. To put in context, the impact that we saw in the budget revisions downwards are twice as large as what we saw during the Great Recession in 2009. So where do things stand on the budget? The bottom line is the shortfall compared to the January estimates is $750 per pupil for this school year, and that shortfall carries into next year as well. This sort of reduction will require cuts in fund balance, athletics, enrichment, and instructional programs for many districts all across the state. There has been no official proration process that has been started by the state. And as you may imagine, reducing funding for schools when the school year is about to be completed has significant political and operational implications that are being considered by the governor and state leaders. Furthermore, it's important that residents and boards of education understand that although the numbers we're discussing are best estimates, they're best estimates based on economic activity and the information that was best available in May. As we know, there are certain restrictions that are still in our economy. There are certain projections that were put forward in May that could or could not come to fruition. And one of the reports that recently came out by the House Fiscal Agency in May suggested that they missed the mark for the month of May in revenue collections by 129.7 million. This equates to roughly an additional $90 per pupil. But one of the complicating factors is the state has changed its policy to where they are allowing extensions on the payment of certain taxes. And therefore that has disrupted the collection of revenue and has impacted how you benchmark against prior years for which revenues you're receiving. So although there is a significant departure from what they expected to collect in the month of May, part of that is due to the fact that there were policies changed by the Department of Treasury that have deferred some of those tax collections that will come in at later dates. One of the challenges we're bringing forward to our legislators and we're helping our communities understand is we truly believe that in order for our economy to fully reopen, we need schools to safely reopen. And that is going to require additional costs. Our National Association for Superintendents put forward this study, and they averaged it to roughly $490 per student to comply with some of the basic requirements under the CDC guidelines. So as you can see, at a time where we're facing decreasing revenues, we're also facing increasing costs in order to make sure we have a safe, healthy learning environment for students. It's important for the board and the broader community to understand that in March, over $2 trillion was allocated in order to support our economy. due to COVID-19. This was done through the CARES Act. Less than 1% of that was actually dedicated towards public K-12 education. When we compare that allocation of $16.5 billion to what was done in 2008 and 2009, you can see it's just 19% of that total for an economic impact due to COVID-19 that's 2.5 times greater than what we saw during the Great Recession. And so what this is saying is that we believe there is a tremendous obligation and a tremendous opportunity for Congress to take additional action based on historical decisions they've made and historical financial support they've provided to support public education all across the country. Included in that request with Congress and in the CARES Act, the state of Michigan received $3.1 billion. These funds were restricted and were to only be used in order to make sure that the state had the services and the equipment and personal protection equipment necessary to combat the coronavirus. Congress had a particular stipulation within those resources that were allocated that said these funds cannot be used to backfill budget shortfalls that state governments are facing. And so part of the request that we're putting forward along with the governor and many others is to say this money has already been allocated to the state of Michigan. Thankfully, we haven't had to spend the vast majority of those funds in order to mitigate the harm of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'd like to have permission along with other states to utilize the remainder of those funds in order to support public education and other important government services. So what is the status on congressional action? Our specific ask is asking for additional funds and flexibility with already allocated funds. This ask is very consistent with what we see all across the state, not only from various organizations that are connected to public education, but also legislative leaders in terms of calling for flexibility with the governor are making that specific push as well. This is not a Michigan-specific topic. This is an issue that states all across the country are facing, no matter what their location or circumstances is. Revenues are on the decline in every state in the country. Thus far, the House of Representatives has recently passed the HEROES Act, which provided an additional $60 billion for public education. Although this was significantly more than what we've seen, it still is inadequate given the shortfalls we see all across the country. And we also know, due to the hyper-partisanship in Washington, the Senate is not expected to take action on that spending bill. And in fact, Leader McConnell has signaled that additional aid package coming from the Senate is likely, but not before the 4th of July, and no specifics on how much or in what form or fashion it will come to states, other than to say kids will be a focus of that stimulus package. So that brings us to the point of our advocacy update to give you more information on how we're trying to engage in the process and make sure that we're making our elected officials aware of the circumstances and our community aware of the circumstances if there is an action at the state and federal level. The first thing you should know, we are deploying a multifaceted advocacy approach. This includes virtual Zoom meetings. This includes op-eds, letters, emails. We're producing videos, and we're also having our state legislators write letters to members of Congress. We want our state delegation to make sure that our congressional delegation understands the dire circumstances we're in and that there is opportunity here for Congress to step up and our congressional delegation to be front and center in requesting additional support to state governments. One of the things we've also done is we've put together informational op-eds to try to give our communities a better understanding of how the COVID pandemic has impacted public education funding. The great challenge we face in the state of Michigan is the executive order that we're operating under for schools required the payment of all district employees in order to continue to receive state funding. And so our community and our residents has seen headlines to where other businesses and other areas of government have had to make reductions. They have not seen those headlines to date for public education. And therefore, for many, there's a disconnect between the funding crisis we're facing and how it impacts the services we want to provide our students. To that end, we've also worked with others across the county to produce informational videos, because we know school funding is a complicated topic, and how can we make sure our residents are better informed of the implications and how our schools are funded in the state of Michigan. So what can you do to help? With the help of others, we've launched a statewide campaign called Our Kids, Our Future, and we have a web presence to where to date, over 27,000 people have used this website to take action to call on their particular members of Congress, including President Trump, to support public education in the state of Michigan. The response has been overwhelming. This opportunity has only been available for 2 weeks, and so it shows and clearly demonstrates that the public feels there's room here for Washington to step up to help support schools during this difficult time. We also have established a robust social media presence, whether that be through Facebook or Twitter, where more information is being shared. And by the day, we're getting more and more followers as people utilize this resource to better understand the impact of COVID-19 and its impact on our school funding. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you may have and appreciate the opportunity.
Chris, because there's a small group, would it be appropriate for folks to just ask questions instead of using the chat feature, or would you much rather use the chat feature? Totally up to you.
I'm comfortable with anyone asking the question.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
And I do want to jump in a moment and encourage everyone to ask as many questions as we can. We know that we're going to have some hard decisions coming up, and a lot of this is not, you know, of our doing or choosing. So I want to make sure that we fully understand, you know, why these decisions need to be made and what implications we're looking at, not just this year in this budget, but the years going forward. So feel free to ask any questions that you have.
Thank you, Madam President. May I ask Mr. Oberst a question? Is Mr. Oberst available?
Is that fine, Dr. Gorman?
Yeah, I know that Chris has a pretty tight schedule.
Okay, so
It's his time.
Okay,
Would it
okay.
be appropriate to table that for just a
Okay,
second, Ms.
Sure,
Lewis?
sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
okay. Well, am I good to assume that we don't have any questions for Chris?
Well, I think for Chris, just in regards to a lot of the, you know, the social media and the feedback that you're getting from across the board, so from businesses, from our constituents, what's your read overall, even with the private and parochial schools? What's your sense overall?
I think there's now more than ever a pretty stark recognition of the important role that public schools play in our economy and how they are pretty much the linchpin by which all other things can happen. And so I think our value has never been higher, especially at the fact that for many, obviously, traditional schooling was completely disrupted, and therefore the work atmosphere and other things was completely disrupted. And there's an acknowledgement that the work that we do day in and day out with kids is vital to the strength of our communities, the strength of our economy, and the strength of our state. And so from there's broad recognition. We've been seeing incredible reaction from our business community, including the Grand Rapids Chamber, who has stepped up and been a part of various announcements and opportunities to support schools. And we know our parent community is being vocal about it. And, you know, the thing that I would make to the point I would make to the board is that the federal action is our best course of action. Our state does not have the resources or the ability to absorb this sort of shortfall and protect public education. Thus far, the action of Congress has been, how do we make sure we're able to stabilize all the aspects of the economy due to the COVID-19 pandemic? And their action to date for public schools has not been sufficient to stabilize the work that we do. And even if Lansing was to consider a tax increase, which is always politically difficult no matter the circumstances, but incredibly difficult when you're seeing unemployment near 20%, those revenues are only coming in a prospective fashion, right? And we have a significant hole that is sitting there this year that needs to be filled. And so that's why it's so vitally important that all of our residents understand what this impact means for their children's schools, but also how they can plug in and make their voice heard so that our congressional delegation is responsive to their needs.
Chris? What about our delegation? I can only assume that our senators are going to support whatever kind of bills we present to them or are presented to them. Who should we be talking to on the federal level? I mean, who should we send letters to? Because I'm sure that our senators know that. And I wonder where Congressman Amash, thank you. Wonder where he's standing on these issues, if you know.
So I will say that our Senate delegation has been very supportive. One of the things that always helps elected officials is you have to build this groundswell of support. That way they can take that information forward to their leaders and help them understand what the implications of inaction, what they would be, and then, you know, what are the expectations for that action. So that's part of where when folks sign petitions, when folks write letters, when there's op-eds, when there's social media activity, it gives them what they need in order to bring forward to their leadership for action. When it comes to our congressional delegation in the House, across West Michigan, we do have varied perspectives of the federal government's role in education. And we're not trying to push for an expanded role or federal presence within public education. What we're saying is when there is a national pandemic and it has implications across our economy and including for public education, there has been times in the past where our federal government has stepped up to provide aid, and there's opportunity for them to do so now. And so that's the message that we're trying to bring forward.
Thank you.
I'm not sure where this fits, but I know that we have, as a board, voted to start a kind of a promise zone for our students, and that's also a benefit to private and parochial. How is that? I don't know how to ask the question, but how does that fit into now that this year we're providing some of those scholarships and whatnot, but how is that affecting this?
Reverend Matthias, when you look at promise zones, one of the reasons we're able to offer that is a growth in property taxes year over year that the school district's able to capture and put towards those grants for students. When you have an early promise zone and it's in its initial standing, obviously there was a substantial amount of financial support that the community provided through contributions to support the effort. But when you look at an ongoing basis, it's very important that we have a growing property tax base to fund the upcoming needs of that promise zone. And so we also know that if we don't have strong schools in a community, it's very difficult to sustain a large property tax base and therefore the proceeds that go to fund those scholarships. Beyond that, there is a small portion of the state School Aid Act that goes to provide resources to promise zones all across the state, but relative to what's collected locally, it's insignificant.
Thank you.
Question, Chris, with respect to scenarios that might be being discussed at the state level with respect to the types of models for continuing to provide services to our students in the upcoming year. Is there any discussion on specific models? Are we looking at perhaps a tendency or a leaning toward continuing the virtual learning programs that we have going for a continued period of time? Or is there, you know, any other suggestions out there that are being looked at as we vie for funding?
So the first thing to make the board aware of is planning for multiple contingencies is happening all across the state. And right now, Governor Whitmer with the Department of Education, they're leading an effort to establish what those recommendations and potential requirements might be. I do think, given the diversity of our state geographically and the students that we serve, there's recognition that there can't be a one-size-fits-all for every circumstance. And there's recognition that when you're dealing with a public health crisis without access to a vaccine, you're going to need to have flexibility as you get more information or potentially we face a second spike. So everybody's strongest desire is to see our children back in school in a face-to-face instruction environment safely. And then it's the definition of what is required in terms of trying to provide that safe environment that schools are going to have to comply with. So let me take this a step further. In the governor's plan for reopening our economy, she references various phases, and those phases and how we transition in and out of them are contingent on how we're doing with the virus and what our healthcare capacity is, things of that nature. So as we continue to make improvements, we're continuing to progress on those phases, which means less requirements are needed. And so it's no exception for schools that there's going to be variations within each phase of what requirements we're going to have to face. We do expect those recommendations by month's end to be put forward by the governor's committee.
Okay, thank you.
One last thing, Chris, if people want to learn more about the school funding, you had some video resources in your presentation. How might folks find those?
So all of those videos and the links, if the PowerPoint's been provided to you, they're available via YouTube. We've also been pushing them out through the social media vehicles. So we would just encourage as board members and others, make sure you're sharing that information, that the public's aware. I think we have an opportunity and obligation as leaders in public education to make sure our citizens and residents understand what we're facing and so that they can act in their own best interest on behalf of their children. So I can make sure as well, there is a direct link provided if you wanted to watch those outside of the presentation.
One of the big questions that I've been getting from community members when I speak to them about this and give them the websites and the petition to take a look at is, the big question is, well, what exactly changed the amount of money that's been given, that is being given to schools? And so is there a quick answer without pointing them towards a slideshow of very specific, these are the reasons we're not getting as much money?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing we can do is demonstrate how the school aid fund is funded. Our predominant funding source to fund K-12 education in the state is sales tax. When you have much of the economy shut down and people aren't purchasing things, there's a significant reduction in revenues. The next biggest source of revenue to the school aid fund is income tax. When you have 25% of people on unemployment, the state's not generating the income tax at the level it anticipated that we saw for year after year. And then the other one, which is a little bit of a lagging indicator, is property taxes. It always takes a little bit longer for property taxes, those revenues to decrease, but predominantly it's sales and income tax. And we can provide a chart that's easy to see to where we can put forward.
Yeah, I think the false assumption that I'm getting from people is that the majority of it is property tax. And so they're wondering how COVID has affected that. So if I were able to show them the percentage from each of those that you just described, I think that would be helpful.
Happy to make that available.
Another question I had is, what would be our position as a board in terms of recommendations that we might, or scenarios that we might think about in terms of opening our schools? So if we knew every kid was tested, or if we knew all of our teachers were tested, what would be our best foot forward in saying this is the scenario that our board would say, yes, we should go forward, even though the governor has said and stipulated some things. We've done our due diligence, and we feel, or we might feel, that under these particular circumstances, we feel that we could open our schools successfully, or given these parameters of how we might do that if we saw some spikes or other kinds of things like that? Or are we just sort of waiting and hoping that someone will tell us what to do.
Dr. Gorman, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I think the various groups that the governor has set up, I know Michael Rice is leading lots of that work, who's a state superintendent. Grand Rapids Public Schools has representation on many of those committees. I know I work with urban superintendents from around the state, but many of those questions that you're asking, Reverend Matias, what we're hearing is around the 4th of July or maybe a little bit before, we'll have many of those answers. And, you know, from Grand Rapids Public Schools perspective, it's how can we prepare for the fall, knowing there's lots of uncertainties. Dr. Roby and I had a connection with Cabinet today, ensuring that we're prepared for every mode of instruction, whether that's face-to-face, whether that's hybrid, whether that's exclusively distance learning. So we need to prepare ourselves for whatever decision that is made, but we're hopeful those decisions are made early July. So we'll be ready to go.
From an advocacy perspective, I think a couple of things come to mind. We're big supporters of the work that's been done through the School Finance Research Collaborative. We do think we need a more equitable form of funding education, public education in the state of Michigan. And I like to remind people that one way you can put forward your values is when you're providing additional resources and what you're putting those resources towards, but also when you're having to make difficult decisions regarding cuts, let's make sure our most vulnerable children aren't bearing the brunt of those reductions. So I think it's important that this board, and I know there's many supporters, including myself all across the state, who will be working towards that end to make sure certain categoricals that go to support the education services that are provided for certain populations are not reduced as a means of balancing the budget.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you so much, Chris, for helping to clarify those details for us.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
And Kathy, I did want to make sure that you were able to ask Larry your question. So
Yes.
Larry, if you don't mind, we'll have Ms. Downs-Lewis.
Okay, I just wonder, with all these numbers and everything, I would like to know, bottom line, how much money we have to cut out of our budget and what percentage of our budget is that?
So before he answers that, Ms. Downs-Lewis, so what we wanted to do this evening was have Chris Glass come in and share the state's perspective. And then Larry is going to, throughout his presentation, answer all those questions for you. We were asked to really get into the weeds and give you as much detail as possible as it relates to what do these cuts mean to the Grand Rapids Public Schools? What is the worst case scenario? So that's what we provided for you in a presentation this evening. Larry, if you feel comfortable answering that now, please feel free, or else Ms. Downs-Lewis, we can present. And then if you still have outstanding questions.
Larry's going to present more tonight?
Yes, he sure is.
All right, okay, I didn't know that. Okay. Fine.
Is that okay, Ms. Grant, if Larry presents?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ms. Grant. So Larry, before you get started, I would just like everyone to know that as we were preparing the initial thoughts as it relates to the budget for you, and I know you're not finalizing a budget for a couple of weeks, we tried our very best to ensure that the cuts are as far away from the classroom as possible. That was our #1 priority in bringing this information to you this evening. That said, these are significant cuts. I heard a neighboring district say that these are cuts that we have not seen in 40 years. And so keep all of that in mind as we present this information to you this evening. This is quite a shortfall. As Larry referenced earlier, pre-COVID, we thought we were going to have some additional funds. That's what we were hearing out of Lansing. Post-COVID, that was a different story. So as you can see, we had to make some adjustments for this particular school year that we didn't anticipate, and also some significant adjustments moving forward into the next school year. We are going to share with you about $10.6 million worth of cuts this evening in a presentation. There's some very difficult decisions that we have to make. I want to continue to preface all of our thoughts this evening by this is our worst case scenario. What we're presenting is our worst case scenario. We don't want to make all the cuts that we're talking about, but this is the very worst. So what you're going to see are central office cuts. You're going to see supplies cuts, things of that nature. You may also see you will see some program reductions that we'll be sharing with you this evening. But keep in mind, this is the worst case scenario because there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty as it relates to funding at the state and the federal level. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Larry Oberst so he can get a little more detailed for you. Mr. Oberst.
Thank you, and good evening again. I'm Act 2 from me. Let me get up the PowerPoint presentation. I figure this thing out here. It's not it. No, I can't see. Everyone had that PowerPoint presentation in front of them. I can't seem to find it to get it on a screen share. Doesn't show up on my.
Does anyone not have it?
Hang on. Oh, here we go.
Greg can help intervene. Here you
Yep. No, I got it. We good?
Okay, I printed it out. Okay.
All right. Everyone have this in their. There we go. All right. Let me just briefly review what I talked about in connection with amendment to the current fiscal year. As I mentioned, if Amendment 2 is adopted, we in our fund balance we use about 6.1 million ending fund balance projected at 6.1 million or 4.2%. And the cut that I talked about earlier and Chris reiterated, we're taking part of it in 1920, $350 per student, which equates to about $4.8 million in reduced state aid. That is in Amendment 2. And so as you look to 2021, let me just give you a little bit of a background of where things started and where we are at now with the budget for next year. We began our budgeting season really last December as we looked at enrollment projections and any program changes that we were aware of. Obviously, we knew at the time we were going to open the new Southwest Community High School. So we were actively looking at that staffing situation. All the things we normally do during a budget process related to looking at people. We knew we had to make some cuts back then just to get the budget to balance. We had also assumed a per pupil increase of $150 per student. The governor released her budget in February of this year. That had a per pupil increase of $150 to $225. Now we would be the 225, but we always start things out conservatively because obviously the final numbers is subject to the legislative process. We had also already built into the budget for next year an overall average 1% increase for all employees across the district, and the hard cap, which is the amount of dollars that we pay per employee for health coverage. That hard cap is adjusted annually based on an inflation factor that's determined by the Department of Treasury. We were made aware of that hard cap increase in early March. That was 3.3%, and we had built that into our cost structure already for the 2021 year. So 150 increase in revenue. And the governor also had some increases in special ed in that budget. We had made some minor increases in that also for the budget so far prior to the shutdown. So as we've talked about already tonight, the post-COVID-19 school aid fund, as Chris mentioned, the revenue shortfall is, 1.25 million. However, the school aid fund started the year with a positive fund balance. So that revenue shortfall that Chris talked about, that results in the fund at the end of the state fiscal year, September 30th, projected at a $1.1 billion fund deficit. So it's a $1.1 billion that has to be covered from some source because the state has to have a balanced budget at the end of the year. The $1.25 million decrease in revenue resulted in this $1.1 billion. That's what has to be covered. And that's where the $650 per student cut came from. If the solution for the current year is not to reduce expenditures, but to find a new source of revenue, i.e. the federal government, that would carry forward, or that would cure the problem this year, but we'd still have a $963 million projected as a school aid fund deficit in 2021 because expenditures would not have been cut this year going into next year. So regardless of, unless we get coverage for the next 2 years of deficits, we're going to be faced with some significant cuts that will carry into obviously 2021 and beyond actually. So the $650 per student is the projected foundation cut now. I want to remind the board that the school aid fund not only funds us over the last about 12 years, it's also funded community colleges and higher education. They will shoulder their proportion of that 1.1 billion. So our portion, the K through 12 education, comes out to about $650 a student. And that's the target we are working with. And I will tell you, my colleagues within the ISD are working with a per pupil deficit between $500 a student and $750 a student. I will also tell you, and as Chris mentioned, May 15th is when the revenue estimating conference was done, where the $1.1 billion deficit was determined. We were at that point 6 weeks from our current fiscal year closing. We couldn't do much to cure that deficit in the current year. Plus, as a result of the governor's executive order for distant learning, we were required to maintain paying all our employees for the fiscal year. So that's why in Amendment 2, we have that use of fund balance, because we're assuming a cut in state revenue, but we had no ability to make any significant cuts in our cost structure to offset that. So again, regardless of what year we take it in, this year or next year, by June 30th, 2021, if nothing changes, all districts will have reflected in their fund balance ending June 30th of 2021, a $650 per student cut in state aid, okay? Any questions on that background before I get started here in some of the areas where the major cuts reside? What I'm going to go through here is about $10.6 million of identified cuts. The last slide I'll get to, there are some other reductions we made. There are also some additional reductions as part that aren't included in the 10.6 million. As I said earlier, prior to the COVID-19 shutdown, we're already making some changes in our cost structure based on factors that exist at that point in time. And so those are some additional cuts we'd identified prior to the COVID-19. The vast majority of this 10.6 million that I have detailed out to you are as a result of the $650 per cut in state aid we're looking at, okay? So alphabetically, the assessment area, no cuts in FTEs, cuts in other areas. A big portion of that was testing costs, which we're actually able to reallocate to another grant area. So it'll be funded by grant dollars proposed in 2021 as opposed from the general operating fund. The Board of Education Superintendent's Office, we had 2 contract staff working throughout most of last year. We're projecting not to use those staff, and there were some other cuts in areas like travel allowances, cell phone allowances, travel costs that get charged to those particular departments. The business office, my area, includes 3 FTE reductions. Let me also mention before I forget that you'll see here the total FTE reductions proposed totals about 93 here. We are looking at about 100 proposed reduction in FTEs. About 20% of that 100, around 20, are actual vacancies that we currently have that we would intend not to fill. So there are actually 20 positions that don't have people currently in those positions that we're proposing not to fill those vacancies. And we have one of those in actually 2 of those in my office. So 2 of those 3 FTEs would be vacancies that I would propose not to fill. Communication area, 1 FTE, that is currently a vacancy also that we would not fill, as well as some reduction in our marketing and advertising and communication budgets, some of the outside services we purchased over the years. Community and student services, mostly the 5 FTEs are mostly vacancies that we currently have or are going to have that we intend not to fill. The curriculum area, we're looking at a reduction of 1 FTE there. There are also, as you may recall, we have been acquiring new curriculum over the last, I believe 2021 would be our 5th year, starting with Discovery Science, and then Go Math, and then part of our ELA last year, the remainder of our ELA this year, which is still in the budget. But between the FTE reduction and some of the earlier, all of our curriculum acquisitions, as you may remember, because they got on the purchasing agenda, are pricey, and they're all web-based. So there's licensing fees attached to that. And we generally pay for the license. It's a license over 5 to 6 years. So we pay for the license and the materials over a 5 or 6, multi-year time frame. Some of the reduction in the curriculum is related to like the Discovery Ed and the Go Math, 2 of our earlier acquisitions, where on the time payments are less in the later years than in the earlier years. So we have some savings there, offset by some additional costs related to the new ELA curriculum we are acquiring. District administration is primarily out in the buildings, the deans, the assistant principals and principals. I will tell you that there had been some reductions in movement prior to COVID-19. We looked at the enrollments in our various buildings and the administrators in those buildings. We had already made a determination that there needed to be some reductions there. So that's not totally related to COVID-19 and the reduction in the state aid we talked about. Early childhood, just a half an FTE there. Human resources, 2.5 FTEs, which includes 1.5 FTEs of a vacancy that we're not going to fill. Media services, essentially an FTE there and some other supply costs. In the MIS area, an FTE reduction there and some reductions in other costs there. A lot of our licensing dollars get run through that MIS area. Special programs throughout the district, we're looking at reducing 210,000, various areas there. The operation facilities area, we currently have a number of vacancies in that area, 30 custodial vacancies alone. We also, over the years, have had a number of vacancies in our skilled trades areas. And even though we've been actively advertising, trying to fill those positions, it's been very difficult when the economy's been good to fill those skilled trade positions. So of those 9 FTEs, most of those would be vacancies that were taken off the table to fill. We still are going to need to hire custodians. If we go back, we can probably get by this summertime with our custodial staff, getting things cleaned up for the opening of school. But if we have any kind of physical presence of students in our buildings, we will have to hire more custodians because of the additional cleaning needs, or at the very least, we can't get them, contract for those services. Some of the other building changes, and this relates to movement amongst buildings of personnel, it's retirements, positions we're not filling. It's also situations where we had retirements of positions that we filled, but filled with a lower cost employee, a newer employee, to the lower cost of the salary structure. There are also some changes to some of the building supplies that we allocate to the buildings also, and the principal funds that are essentially discretionary funds that principals used. Part of those reduction principal funds is because beginning last year, you may recall, Student Advancement Foundation had an additional contribution a year and a half ago now of dollars to be used for principal funds. So they had been giving us, I think, $900 per building for principal use, and they increased that to a couple thousand. And they intend to continue that going into this 2021 year. So we're able to reduce board dollars allocated and still give the principals to have some discretionary dollars to use for their building. The PBIS area, which primarily some reductions in some supply costs that we have there. We're not looking at reducing an FTE there. Most of their FTEs are paid for with grant dollars anyways. There's not a lot of Board of Education dollars that go into the PBS program. Some additional program reductions, 32.5 FTEs. Purchasing, one of our purchasing directors left mid-year. We're proposing not to replace that position and eliminating a second position, amongst some other savings there. Student data services, they have a couple of vacancies. That's those 2 FTEs that we intend not to fill. Security, we're going to reduce the security staff by 3 FTEs. Shared time, because of some reallocation there, 1 FTE reduction there. The special ed area, there is some support staff we believe we can do without. It's part of those 6 FTE reductions there. Special ed is by and large, beyond that's been not touched because of the regulatory environment, number of what you've done there. Staff development reduction 56.5. There was a partial FTE. It was being funded out of board dollars in the current year. And we were able to do some movement to get that half position funded by, I think it's Title II dollars, and reduce a half. And so there's really no FTEs that we're reducing out of there, net, if you will. Supply area, in our warehousing area, there's 6 FTEs reduction there. The transportation, by Dean Transportation, the last 6 weeks, we've had 3 fruitful discussions with them. Initially, we told them we needed to find some savings in transportation. And they came back. Our most recent conversation was a week ago. They had about 10 different options for saving transportation dollars for us to choose from. And those 10 options at the high end could save up to almost $3 million. We looked at them, considered them all. We believe we have a minimum of $1 million that we could get out of transportation that would not have a significant service impact on our students. And again, there may be more there depending on what else we might need, but we believe the $1 million is a good number to start with minimal impact on our students. And as I said earlier, all those reductions I just detailed for you total about $10.6 million. Let me just finish this and I'll be happy to take questions. In addition to those cuts, reductions I talked about, we're also proposing the freeze of district-wide compensation. As I said earlier, we had started the budgeting process with a 1% increase in compensation. We are proposing not to do that. All 6 of our union contracts, minimally as it relates to compensation and the hard cap, would have to be renegotiated after June 30th. So we currently have no commitment for any further compensation increases for our bargaining units, all 6 of them. Same with the hard cap. The hard cap is negotiated every year, as is compensation. So those, there's no commitment beyond June 30th. With the non-union employees, obviously hard cap and compensation is discretionary with superintendent. The past practice has been, certainly as long as Teresa's been around, maybe before that, is that the non-union employees that typically have gotten what the unions have gotten in terms of percentage increase in compensation and the hard cap increase. So across the district-wide, forego compensation and forego the hard cap increase. The revenue, as I said earlier, under the Amendment 2 discussion, includes a $4.5 million of ESSER funds, and we are using that to plug this budget hole. So in the current year, the cuts would have been $4.5 million more, the reductions would have been $4.5 million more if it was not for the ESSER funds. We were able to spend those dollars really any way we want to. So given the budget hole we had to fill, using that $4.5 million. I will again caution the board that is just at this point, just a 2021 budget number. It goes away for next year, the 21-22 year, unless something comes in to replace it, which we don't at this point don't know about. And we're also assuming another $1.7 million of property sales. Again, the Amendment 2 discussion. I told you in the current year we had budgeted $1.5 million of property sales. We only sold 1 property. It actually was in process when last year ended, but we now are putting back another $1.7 million of empty buildings we still have. Hopefully we can dispose of some of them. In addition, there are 3 buildings that we currently own that are being leased by the ISD, Beckwith, which is where the adult ed is housed. You may recall we transferred the adult ed to the intermediate school district, I believe 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now. They are leasing space in that building. And then KEC, Oakley, and Strait are our buildings that center-based programs are in there. And since the ISD runs the center-based programs, they are leasing those buildings for us. We have a program in the Strait building, but we would, and prior to about a year ago, you may recall, the ISD's finance director, Mike Haggerty, took another job, and Kevin Phillips, who had been at East Grand Rapids, moved there. Mike and I had begun discussions about the ISD interest in acquiring those 3 buildings I just mentioned from us. And when Kevin took over, we were going to continue the conversation, but he was getting his feet on the ground and getting to know the ISD area. And then by the time we were talking about or restarting those discussions about acquiring those 3 buildings, the shutdown occurred, and things. So my intent would be to begin those discussions again into the new fiscal year and seeing what the ISD is still interested, or they still have the financial wherewithal to be able to do that, given the funding changes for all of us. But those are also, that property sale is also in the 2021 proposed budget. That would also be a 1-year only revenue increase. And that would have to be, absent any other revenue sources for the 21-22 year, we'd have to make some additional reduction. So if you looked in the last 2 pages of our, this is just a snapshot then of what the proposed budget looks like on the revenue side. First page here, we're looking at $210,000, almost $211,000 in revenue. We had begun the year, the 19-20 year, with revenue projections of about $222 million. You can see it's about $12 million decrease in revenue, and that 210 number includes $4.5 million of ESSER funds, so it's really about $16 million less of continuing revenue, if you will. And then on the expense side, all those reductions we just talked about, the 10.6 million, are reflected in these numbers at this point in time. You can see what we'd use, projected use a fund balance of 5.2 million. If Amendment 2 is adopted, as we talked about earlier, that would reduce our fund balance at the end of this month, 15 days, to 6.1 million. So at the end of next year, with a $650 per pupil cut and the expense reductions we've made, would get us down to a fund balance of about $852,000, which is 0.61%. Let me just make one other comment about the proposed reductions. As Ron mentioned, we try to keep them as far away from the classroom as we could. These reductions primarily do that. However, we have cut deeply into some of the central office operations, and it will have a service impact if these cuts remain in place at the central office, to not only our internal customers, but to our also external customers. But, you know, to keep it out of the classroom and to not have to reduce the GREA staff significantly and thereby increase class size, this is the route we started with. And this is our best, as Ron said, it, the way we know things now, we hope this would be the worst case scenario. And this is our best attempt at this point of trying to make some reductions, keeping them as far away from the classroom as we can. And at the same time, as you can see, we started this year, board members, with a fund balance of 12.3 million. And as you can see here, we'd end up next year into this scenario of 850,000. So this even includes using a chunk of fund balance. So any reinstatement of some of these reductions we've talked about, it's a zero-sum game, board members. If we want to reinstitute some of these reductions we've suggested, then we're going to have to make some cuts somewhere else. You cannot adopt by law budget that takes your accumulated fund balance below zero. As you can see here, this gets it awful close to that. So I will stop now and entertain any questions that you might have.
This is Kim Williams. I have a question. My question is regarding the 5%. It looks like the projections for this year and next year would put us well below that.
Yep.
What type of implications will that have for the third year?
The third year, depending, I'll tell you right now, the revenue estimating conference in the third year, let's just, again, this is all based on scenarios. If the reductions that we are talking about take effect, and we have to do these reductions because there's no other source of revenue at the state level, by the third year, they would actually, the projections would result at the reduced spending levels, would result in a school aid fund balance of over about $600 million, which would indicate looks like there should be able to reinstate a portion of the 650 cut. Not much, but somewhat. It's hard, I tell you, Ms. Williams, it's hard enough to project into next year and to go into 21, 22. And as Chris said, you know, there already was in May, the revenue they actually came in was $127 million below the projection that was done on May 15th. All this uncertainty. I don't think that Chris did mention, but I will. Right now they intend to have another revenue estimating conference in August. I don't think a date has been set yet, but the state income tax filing deadline, as you probably know, was delayed until July 15th. So at that point in time in August, they believe they would have a better idea what income tax collections look like, which is why they want to have that estimating conference prior to the end of the state's fiscal year to see if the projections made the May conference still hold true, are better or worse. What may come down from the feds by then, who knows?
Larry, I have a couple questions. You mentioned that as you were looking at these adjustments or cuts, you're trying to stay away from the classroom, and you mentioned that there was going to be significant cuts in central office, and you mentioned in terms of service to who, or what does that look like overall? Does it have to do with when students are signing up for classes, and is it more automated? What, I know it's
Yeah.
disjointed, but
You know, one thing I can't project with certainty, Reverend Matisse, is we believe, although we've seen some of it already I think we're now in our 14th week of essentially working remotely. You know, we have made some changes in procedures. We are still in the process of better automating our enrollment process, some of our communication processes. Certainly, we're still, and we intend to finish the upgrade of the business office software. So I think we can certainly build some efficiencies. I also have great faith in the employees that will remain, that, as we've seen already, as you know, the fact that we had to take this, you've heard before, 150-year-old education model and do a 180 in a matter of a couple of weeks to do distant learning. And we did that pretty successfully, I think. So when our people are pushed to think outside the box in a critical situation, as they are now, they can do that. So I say that based on current, the way we do business currently, but I think we will make some changes. We certainly can adapt. But a lot of it, I will tell you, Reverend Matisse, also comes down to we internally have to simply plan better in advance. You know, too much of what goes on now is we have short deadlines we place on each of us. So we've had this conversation already at the cabinet level that you know, we just got to be, all of us, not just cabinet, but all of us in the central office. You know, there's a number of things that happen all the time at the same time of the year. We just got to have a better overall calendar and plan better. So, because we can't have something, and granted, things come up all the time, but that should be an exception and not the rule. So it's hard to say the exact impact but it'll the things I talked about in terms of adapting, it's going to take a little bit of time, but it's just the responsiveness may not be as timely as both our internal customers and our external customers are used to.
Larry, can you remind us of the fund balance equation? I know that can be a confusing part of what we talk about, and it's a big part of what we talk about. So can you remind us how that's calculated?
Yeah, the way it's calculated is we take the ending general fund balance, and again, the general fund is our general operating fund. It's really the fund that we make our business decisions, and we take that number, and as I mentioned, the page I have up, in the case of 2021 would be $852,000. And we divide that by unrestricted general fund revenue. In the general fund, there are two major columns, and you saw that on the amendment too that I talked about. There is the general operating column, which impacts our fund balance, and then you have the grant dollars. Those are for specific services. Whatever grant dollars we get, even though they flow through the general fund, we only spend what we get, so it has no impact. And so those restricted dollars in the general fund are pulled out of the revenue base for the calculation. And actually, let me pull up. Let's go back to that, what we're talking about. So Everyone can see this fund balance analysis again. We'll lay it out here. It's top line there, fund balance. You can see 6.1 million in the blue column, 852 end of next year in the rose colored column. Then down below it are the revenue, the includable revenue factors, our local revenue, which is primarily property tax, and our, it's property taxes, and the state unrestricted revenue. You can see there is the remainder of the foundation allowance. In the blue column, it's 82.8 million. We have some Renaissance zone reductions that come out of that. Minimal amounts of federal unrestricted dollars. Most of our federal dollars are the title programs, so they're not included in the revenue base. The local dollars are other unrestricted grants, and I believe the enhancement millage is in there. And then athletics is actually sitting in a separate column. It's in our fund balance. And that's really, 710 is a transfer, so it stays in as unrestricted revenue because we can transfer it anywhere. So you can see in the blue column, the total revenue base is a 145,256. So we divide the 6,115,000 at the top there, the blue column I'm looking at, that 145,256. And then we see the 4.21% projected end of this year, and the one column to the right, same calculation for based on the budget we just went over, proposed budget we just went over, gets us down to 0.61%. I don't know, I think, I will tell you that about a month ago I was on a webinar. This is the same calculation, by the way, that the state uses under the early warning scenario, early warning legislation that they look at. The 5% minimum fund balance is one of the factors they looked at. The webinar I was in about a month ago, there was a representative from Treasury, and this question was asked because there was a belief that many more districts were going to fall under the 5% minimum. And the concern was, well, are we all now going to be subject to the initially additional reporting required by being under 5%? The Treasury official, again, not speaking officially, but she believed, given the circumstances, that there would not be a strict adherence to that unless there were other critical factors that they look at that were also kicking in, i.e., what if there was a significant decrease in the enrollment number? And they had seen a enrollment decrease of the prior. They really look at things on a 3-year moving scenario, if you will. So take other things into effect. I don't know, going 1 year out to 2021, if we're at, 0.61%. At this point, it's too early to say. I think we're all hoping that something would happen before the end of next June that would come to fruition. But again, the budget that we have to bring to you folks as board members and what you have to ultimately adopt in 2 weeks is based on what we know right now with some level of certainty. And this is what we know right now. I can't tell you, we may not know something before next, 2 weeks from today. And Dr. Gorman, I don't know if you want to say something about some meetings we're hoping to have also that for some additional input.
Yeah, absolutely. So of course, 2 weeks from tonight, we have our meeting where we vote on, where you all vote on the budget. We have that. We are going to have a town hall next week, Monday at 6:30. Of course, you'll be able to access that just like you can right now via Facebook and the website and things of that nature. So the town hall is Monday, June 22nd at 6:30. We will also be connecting with union leadership after this presentation. I know that Sharon Pitson, Larry Oberst, and some other members of our team we'll be connecting with our union leadership to really share what our ideas are and of course get their thoughts. Additionally, we'll be working with building-based staff, surveying them as it relates to what's been shared this evening. So we're trying to really be as transparent as possible. Of course, I'll be consulting with Dr. Roby as well. And so again, being as transparent as possible, knowing that we have some very difficult decisions to make.
I also want to add, for those that have, I think all of you have been on the board for more than a year. You did not see tonight the typical, about 20-page budget document that we prepare, which shows some additional detail. The reason I didn't do that is we didn't do that is the cuts we're talking about are significant, and to get into the weeds right now doesn't make a lot of sense. Plus, really things are changing, certainly weekly, in some cases daily. And so I fully expect, at least amongst some categories, by 2 weeks from now, things are going to change. And so we didn't want to get into providing all the detail to you at this point. Obviously, the budget packet we bring to you in 2 weeks, what that looks like, will have the typical detail that you're used to seeing for you to adopt, where it actually pushes everything back into the particular department areas for you to take a glance at. But my belief was we're talking big numbers here. And so giving you just the 2-page proposed revenue and expenditures based on the reductions we talked about. But ultimately what we come up with in 2 weeks, as Ron said, there are likely things will change amongst departments between lines based on all the additional input we're going to get. And we'll reflect that in the final budget proposal in 2 weeks to you.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm also wondering in terms of with these major cuts that we're going to be voting on, I'm wondering what recommendations you're going to have for our parents and stakeholders to help us through this. So in other words, again, we're going to be putting a lot more pressure, I suspect, on our parents to do a whole lot more educating, helping with homework and networking to get those kinds of services or prep work, I suspect. So hopefully we'll have a robust discussion on what that's going to look like going forward, how we prepare our district, our parents, our stakeholders to help us in these. If some are going to step up in certain areas, hopefully you'll have some answers for us in those discussions in a couple of weeks.
Yes, sir, Reverend Matias, absolutely.
Okay, do we have any more questions? All right, thank you, Mr. Oberst, for that overview and for taking time to answer those questions. Dr. Gorman, do you have any comments to wrap that up? Or?
Well, just again, thank you so much. I know it was a very long, very comprehensive presentation. We wanted to set the context at the state and federal level, as well as share with you some of our internal thinking as it relates to this year's budget. These are challenging times. This is not what we expected, but we're trying to do our very best at this time with the information we have to get our preliminary thoughts to you. So as soon as we hear more information, of course, we'll be as transparent as possible in sharing that information with you. But at this time, Ms. Grant, I don't have any additional information for you.
Thank you. And as you all know, and as it's been said this evening, we will still have the public forum. So as we are fielding questions from the community, you all are also welcome to have more questions now that you've had a full deep dive of this information. You all can definitely communicate over the week with specific questions if there's something a little bit more in depth, so that you can give people time to do that research. I really do encourage that, because the questions that you have, the community may have as well. And so to think of those things, ask those things ahead of time so that people can pull the data that's needed. If you have feedback on the presentation tonight, that may help the full board understand things in a better way, please share that information as well. I believe we do have public comment for this evening. Let's see. I have the name Marissa Postler.
Mr. Brandt, there's no one in the meeting by that name. Marissa, if you are out there with a different name and would care to raise your hand.
Yes, if you were able to hear Craig, the moderator, he was saying there's no one on the meeting by that name, but if you are under a different name, please feel free to let us know so that you can join us. Okay. Well, we don't have Marissa on with us right now, so if there is nothing else for the good of the cause, I will say that this meeting is adjourned.